Welcome back, everyone, to another recap video of the Gibraltar Battle of the Sexes. And I actually want to start this video by addressing a lot of recurring YouTube comments and questions asking when I'm getting the GM title and if I got any GM norms from this tournament. In the previous video, I shared my game against Grandmaster Pierre Crowling, in which I won. And I also beat GM Nino Batsiashvili earlier in the tournament. So up until this point, I have defeated 2 Grandmasters, but that doesn't mean I get a Grandmaster norm. And I just want to clarify maybe some misconceptions and educate the YouTube viewers about what it actually takes to get the Grandmaster title. And I'll share the Wikipedia page. And to get the Grandmaster title, you need 3 norms and you need a FIDE rating of 2,500. Currently, my FIDE rating is in the 2350s and I have no Grandmaster norms. So I'm very far away. It takes a long time to gain FIDE rating, especially the higher you go, the harder it is to gain rating. And to get a norm, it's also very difficult. You need a performance rating of 2,600. You need to play at least 3 Grandmasters in a 9 or 10 round tournament. And you need to play a mix of federations too. So your opponents have to come from different countries. And even though there were Grandmaster norm opportunities in Gibraltar, another player actually got a Grandmaster norm. Congratulations to Balázs Sanka from Hungary. He scored 6.5 out of 10, and that was enough to get a Grandmaster norm. In general, it's very, very difficult, and it requires a lot of consistency. And yeah, for those asking if getting the Grandmaster title is a goal of mine, of course I want to get better at chess. It would be nice to get the GM title someday, but realistically, it's very difficult to achieve, and it would require a lot of sacrifices on my part. I would need to travel more for international tournaments. I would have to dedicate hours more every day of studying, and I'd probably have to make less content to just focus on getting better at chess. And I really enjoy the kind of streaming and YouTube content that I'm doing these days. So I'm trying to still stay passionate about the game, and that won't stop me from competing and traveling. And I do have tournaments coming up that I'll talk about in future videos. But for now, I'm trying to be realistic and accept the fact that the GM title is still far away and it'll take a lot of work to achieve. So with all that said, I do want to share my round 8 game from the Gibraltar Battle of the Sexes. In this game, I was playing International Master Gunay Mammadza from Azerbaijan. And this was a really topsy-turvy game. This was probably one of my craziest games in the tournament. And it started with a London opening, second time for me playing the London in this tournament. And I decided to play it because I had some ideas against Gunay's repertoire. And actually, from very early on, after my next move, 95, she started taking a lot of time in the opening. And 95 is not the most common move. I've given a bunch of lectures on the London in the past, and I usually recommend bishop g3. But 95 is somewhat of a new trend. I started learning this move from watching Gadakomsky's games, just watching his online blitz games, because he enjoys playing this move a lot. And it offers some very tricky and venomous lines, especially if Black's not prepared. So going forward, she castled, played knight d2. This is all still opening prep for me. And b6 is somewhat of a secondary move. The main line is c5, c3, knight to c6, bishop d3, queen c7, and I would have played knight f3 here, and this is sort of the main tabia position. Most common move is knight e4. Just to illustrate one potential trap, if knight d7, which looks very natural to try and just target the knight on e5, white is already almost winning with the move knight g5. And if you're curious to analyze this further, the engine will kind of share the best variations, but the attack on the king side is very overwhelming, and after knight f6 back to defend, there's knight g4, and white is having a very powerful attack. So going back, b6, it's slightly a less confrontational move, but it does give white time to get kind of an interesting setup. And the move I played here is pawn h4, which, if I check in the master's database, this move has only been played twice before, once actually by Andrew Tang. And h4 is actually the engine's top recommendation, according to Stockfish 14. So it's kind of a new engine-inspired way of playing, where white just wants to gain space on the king side and create scenarios where it'll be easier to attack in the middle game. And I'm also delaying developing the light squared bishop. In the event of bishop to a6, I can take it immediately. If I play bishop d3 first and then bishop a6, I might lose at tempo if I decide to take in this position. So played h4, bishop e7, and queen f3. So maybe not the typical setup in the London. Usually the knight goes to f3, but with the queen on f3, it enables for the eventual queen g3 to reinforce e5 and also align with the king. And here she played somewhat of a surprising move, knight to c6. Almost always, if black plays knight c6, it's after black has already played c5, and looks a little bit awkward to put the knight in front of the c-pawn. But it was played with some interesting intention. For example, if I play bishop d3, then she can play knight b4 and probably force a trade of some minor pieces. And there's another idea here of playing knight e7 just to reroute and then eventually play c5. So I decided to play h5 here, just gain space, threatening h6, which I think is a positional threat. So she played h6 herself. I played c3, restricting the knight on c6, and she played king h8. So up until this point, she'd already used a lot of time, and I was feeling quite comfortable, have a nice grip in the center, and king h8 is a sign that maybe it's not entirely clear what black is trying to accomplish in this position. So I went ahead, complete development, bishop d3, and then after the trade on e5, takes, knight d7, it's looking really good for white because I just got the bishop pair, and now I have a pawn in e5, which I do defend with queen g3. And during the game, I thought I was much, much better. But it turns out that black does have counterplay here, and she was actually really resourceful with the next few moves, starting with knight c5, grabbing initiative by hitting the bishop, and after I retreated, she plays a really nice move, bishop to a6, where this basically turns one of her worst pieces into one of her best pieces. Now the bishop pierces through the diagonal, prevents me from castling kingside, but also targets the d3 square, which is a bit of a weakness in my position. Now I have to worry about bishop d3 or knight d3, and here it's looking very likely I'm going to have to trade off my light squared bishop, which is one of the kind of potential attackers against the king side. So I thought for a bit here and decided that I'm best just castling queenside and trying to create a sharp game, getting my rook to the center. So she continued here with bishop to d3, offering the trade, and I didn't want to take immediately, which would allow takes, king b1, and then knight takes f4. And I think the more things that are traded, the more comfortable black becomes just with the space deficit. So rather than taking on d3, I left the tension and played what I thought was kind of an interesting move, is queen to h2. Even though it looks a little bit strange, the idea is to make way for the g-pawn. And one of the ways white can try to just attack ruthlessly and open up the king side is with the eventual pawn g5 break to open up the g-file, and if I can get rid of the h-pawn, then maybe my h-pawn can advance. So my intentions were very clear here. And here she played a very timely move, pawn to f6, which does a lot of useful things for black, aims to get rid of my e5 pawn, And even though it looks a little bit weakening to the g5 square, black does want to open the f-file and create counterplay. Maybe at first it looks like I can win the c7 pawn if takes, and bishop takes c7, but this would just lose f2, and it would just be a very bad transformation for white. So after she played f6, I played the move knight to f3, attempting to reinforce e5 and also unleash the rook to attack the bishop. We trade on c2 and then trade on e5. And now I have to take with the bishop on e5. If I take with the knight, then this would lose f2 after takes, takes, and takes. So trying to hold my ground, and after takes, I take with the queen on e5. After the dust has settled a little bit, it turns out that black is actually completely fine here, and I don't really have much of an attack on the king side. She hits my queen with rook f5, I move back, and then knight e4. Black actually has a good grip on the position, and black is almost certainly the one for choice here. And during the game, I was still optimistic because I did have a pretty substantial time advantage. We're on move 21, and I believe she was already below 10 minutes at this point, just having spent so much time in the opening. And okay, the game continues from here. I play rook hf1, defending the f-pawn. She plays c5, and then I play knight to e5. So trying to make use of my knight, e5 is a very nice square, and I'm now eyeing the g6 square. So she plays queen e8, hitting h5. I play g4, hitting the rook and defending h5. And now queen a4 check, which I guess was another point of queen e8. And turns out the queen is a little bit annoying here, because the move I would like to play is king to b1, but this would leave my rook a bit vulnerable, and now my rook on f1 is overworked because it's defending d1 and it's defending f2, and black can just take on f2 here, and I can't take back with rook because I get mated. And this is actually completely losing for white because my queen is hit, and black has a mate in 2 threat as well. So after queen a4, I didn't see this coming, and I played the move king to c1, which is not the greatest square for the king, but it does keep the rook covered, and black doesn't have time to take on a2 because the rook is still hit on f5. So she played rook f6, I play f3, knight g5, and then I play f4. And I thought things were very much going in my favor here, just getting initiative against the knight. And then she played a move which I had completely overlooked. And already at this point, I think she was below a minute. But after the next move, I realized that the position is quite complicated. It turns out the knight doesn't have to move here, and black can go ahead and take on a2. And the problem for white is I can't immediately take on g5 because after takes, queen a1 check, white is the one just losing material. So going back, queen takes a2 is very resourceful, and I just have to find a different option rather than taking the knight. And I decided to play king c2 here, which gets my king off the first rank and now does have the threat of taking the knight. And even though I'm down a pawn here, the black won a2, I was still feeling optimistic because I have this nice kind of pawn storm on the king side, and I thought there's good attacking potential. But after queen a4, king b1, e4, black also has good attacking potential, and things can get very sharp and dangerous if I'm not careful. So I play rook g1 here, trying to prepare the g5 break. She plays queen b3, and unfortunately black is the first one to start throwing punches here, because now there's a lethal threat of knight takes c3, and there's not too many ways for white to defend. So the move I played is queen c2, just trying to neutralize and trade queens, and then still try and attack on the king side. In hindsight, maybe I should have played rook c1, which would have left queens on the board and made things just more sharp and interesting. But I played queen c2, and we traded queens. And after pawn c4, rook a1, I'm down a pawn, but there's still kind of the element of time trouble, And I was hopeful to get some setup with rook a6 and then rook a1 to pressure black's queenside pawns. But she played a nice move here, knight c5, just covering the squares on the queen side, also targeting some weak light squares in my position. And here I played g5, trying to break through on the king side. Takes. And here's where she made a clear mistake in time trouble. Played a move which tried to simplify, but it turned out to simplify in my favor. It was rook to f5. Black should have played knight e4 just to chase my rook away and just kind of keep the position stable. But the problem with rook f5 is I was very happy to take, and after e takes f5, play the move rook to d1. And it turns out that I'm winning back the pawn because there's not a great way for black to keep the d5 pawn defended. If rook to 8 here, then I have a very simple fork. Now momentum is beginning to shift back in my favor. She played the move knight d3, which is an attempt to just try and simplify even further. But after knight takes d3, cd3, rook d3, I won back the pawn, and I'm still threatening the d5 pawn. So she plays rook to d8. And now I play the move c4, and it looks like I'm going to win the pawn because there's a pin. How does black defend? But then she has a move rook to c8 with a counter pin and counter attack. Now it's my pawn who's attacked twice. So we actually end up trading pawns. But after takes and takes, we're very quickly simplifying deep into a rook ending. I play king d3, rook b4, and at this point we've passed move 40. We each got an extra half hour. And at first, it looks like the position is just heading towards a draw because it's currently equal material. It's rook in 4 versus rook in 4. Looks like we're about to trade f5 for b2. And the move I initially wanted to play here was king c3 to defend and attack. But then black has rook e4, and e3 would be hanging, and I probably have to just repeat. So rather than going into any sort of repetition with king c3, I realized that I can take on f5, and if black takes on b2, now it's rook in 3 versus rook in 3, but it's white who has very, very good winning chances here because after rook f8, king h7, e4, this pawn is ready to just bolt down the board. And black is just really stuck on the king side. Can't play king h6 because rook h8 checkmate. And if g6, then I can play rook f7, king h6 takes, and takes. This would be a winning endgame for white. So long story short, we got to this position. I took on f5, and then she started thinking for a while because she made the realization that rook takes b2. It just leads to a position which looks completely winning for white. So she ended up playing rook b3 check first to try and make my king decide where it wants to go. I played king d4, and then she played king g8, ensuring that I don't have rook f8 and the king will be closer to the center in the event that my e-pawn starts advancing. The drawback of king g8 is I have a nice move rook to g5, which I played, and this move has two purposes. First of all, I am intending to potentially go back to g2 and just defend the pawn, but I'm also having a tactical threat of h6 here. And there's not enough time for black to really address everything that I want to do. And she played king f7, and then I have time for rook g2. And now it's white just playing for a win because I have an extra pawn, and I also have the only passed pawn on the board. So I was feeling very, very good here. And if we just go forward a few moves, rook b5 was played, play rook h2, king e7. And then I simplified down with pawn h6, forcing a trade. And even though I do lose b2, I have rook h7, king d6, and rook takes a7. And here we reach a pretty well-known type of rook ending where white has two connected passed pawns, black has one passed pawn. And I knew during the game that this should be a pretty straightforward win for white. But as we're going to see, it still takes some technique to get the job done. And she started with rook f2, which is a nice move. It does paralyze both my pawns because can't play f5 and e4 would lose f4. So I start here with rook h7. She plays rook d2. I play king e4, pawn b5, rook b7, rook b2. And here we reach a critical moment. And I'll say right now that it does pain me to look back at this position because there's so many different ways for white to win here. And I managed to find one of the only moves that makes the position drawn. And even though this is really painful to look back on, especially with the move I played next, it does offer a really valuable lesson, and it shows what I need to work on if I want to reach the next level and maybe chase a GM title someday. I really need to be more precise and robust with my endgames. And when I get a winning advantage, I really, really have to stay focused and not get too relaxed in the midst of a game. And I think the other thing to address here is we played 4 hours of chess to get to this position. And at this point, I was physically and mentally very tired, and it clearly had an impact on my play. And if I really want to improve my game and play at a higher level, I have to work on my physical and mental stamina. I have to put more priority in exercising, sleeping well, diet, because sometimes it's the external factors that can make a big impact on your form in situations like this. So let me show the move that I played is pawn to f5. And in the moment, I thought this is a reasonable move because my simple plan is king f4 and start advancing my pawns. But her next move completely escaped me, the move rook b4 check. And for some reason, when I played f5, this move did not cross my mind because all I was thinking was either b4 or king c6 is coming. But of course, I should anticipate a move like this. And the problem is after rook b4, my king has to move back. I played king f3, and this allows the black king to come in into e5. And from here, the game was still a fight. And I'll share the finish to the game in just a moment. But just to show what I should have done here is play the move king f5. And I'm pretty sure I considered this move, but I was just way too relaxed. I thought everything was winning. And I don't think I played this because I was scared of like king c6, rook b8, king c7. My rook would have had to leave the b file. But this is still a winning position for white because once the king is in front of the passed pawns, it can more easily guide them up the board. And meanwhile, my rook can just come back and prevent the b pawn from promoting. So I should have gone for this position, but can't undo the past. I played pawn f5, allowing rook b4. And it's really unfortunate because after king e5, I played the move e4, and I'm very close to keeping my pawns defended and connected. Black can't take on e4 with the rook because I take on b5, and this is winning for white. But black has to move rook b3 here, and after king g4, king takes e4, it turns into a pawn race, which even though I'm slightly ahead in advancing my pawn, black is just in time to hold the draw. We see what happened in the game. Played pawn f6, rook b1, king g5. At this point, it doesn't make a difference. If I do play f7, then black would just defend and probably transpose into what happened in the game. So play king g5, and now really nice move from black. King d4, just getting the king to help the b pawn advance. And the rook is just about ready to come to f1 to defend against my f-pawn from promoting. And the move I want to play here is pawn to f7. But after rook f1, king g6, king c4, king g7, we'll enter a situation where, yes, I do promote and make a queen and win the rook, but unfortunately, my king is just too far away. And this is a pretty typical endgame scenario where black is gonna basically force me to sack the rook for the pawn or force some sort of perpetual. So rather than going for this line, I decided to play rook h7 in this position. And the point of this move was to be a little bit clever and have the idea of rook h4 and rook f4 to deal with the rook f1 idea. But unfortunately, black starts with the move rook to g1. After king f5, rook f1, I don't really have time to get my rook to f4. And after king e6, b4, I began to accept the reality that this endgame is just a draw, and I missed my my opportunity to win earlier. And yeah, the game ended with some repetition. Really, not much else to do here. So it was a bit of a painful game, given that I worked so hard to get a winning endgame and then spoiled it with one move, this pawn f5 move. But game like this, I think it can happen to everyone. It's one of the brutal things of chess is you build up a winning advantage for several hours, and all it takes is one blunder to give away the advantage. So I hope this offers some lesson to the viewers. Hope you guys learned a thing or two. It was a fun game. Looking back, there were a lot of takeaways in the opening, middle game, especially endgame. So if you have any comments or questions, leave them below, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.